G'day legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day and so far a fantastic week. Now I will say my health is somewhat holding up better than I thought it would. Today is round 4 of my chemotherapy. I finish tomorrow, of course. Each round is 5 doses per 28-day period. So let's see how we go. Fingers crossed, although I believe the weekend and potentially tomorrow may be a little bit rough. But I hope you're all doing better health-wise than myself. Now, of course, legends, as always, we have a lot to go over. We're going to look at the maps, and I'm guessing there's some clickbaity title around this, but it isn't clickbait. I want to show you raw data on this from the maps too. I have a miscellaneous folder. I want to talk about other countries being drawn into the war, as well as looking at some strikes. A lot of this video is going to be going over negotiations, of course, facilitated by the US between Ukraine and Russia. Now, we know the US has an extreme amount of pull on Ukraine and geopolitically, internationally as well. Of course, we saw Trump's plan and his position of real power, regardless of how unpopular it is, between Israel and Gaza yesterday. And what does that tell you into the future? And we're going to go over this large restructure that we're seeing in the Ukrainian armed forces and rehash a couple of points we made the other day about individual brigades and how they can work independently on the front line and a divisional style restructure. So we'll talk about all of that. But let's start where we always do. Not always, but we'll start with our miscellaneous folder. Now, as it has been reported, at least, that the restrictions on Ukrainian strikes deep into Russia have been lifted. Now, there's no official statement on this, but we look at correlation between when the administration in the US changed and the huge increase in these strikes. Well, it seems to match. Now, has policy shifted? Maybe not. Maybe Ukraine is going for more of a better ask for forgiveness rather than permission. And we've seen an increase in these for sure. And we see this footage here. Now, some pages are reporting this as being a Ukrainian domestically produced ballistic missile. I believe this is more likely one of the Ukrainian jet drones that we have been waiting to see enter than this war. It could be either one, of course. We cannot determine it from this footage here, but this is in the Volgograd region against, of course, Russian energy facilities. Now, Zelensky has made a number of statements and talks over the past 24 hours, and we'll go over these. This is being reported by Ukrainska Pravda, saying Zelensky, Putin will do everything to drag Belarus into war. His quote here is saying, "You will see in spring, summer or autumn, he will deploy forces on Belarusian territory." We know there's already Russian forces and missile systems, even some nuclear systems on Belarus's territory. Zelensky says, "I don't know whether there will be an invasion, but in any case, this move will draw Belarus further into the war. In my view, after they attacked Ukraine with missiles, so Russian missiles stationed it as well, even choppers stationed in Belarus on that initial movement into Ukraine, they were already part of the war, but their people and military are not, for now. But Putin is determined to make it happen." Then he talked more about, stated that Putin will also consider ways to provoke other countries. Poland could be next, or the Baltic countries. And this isn't just some random rhetoric. Perhaps even the US. Now, in my opinion, looking at this, drawing in these nations is exactly the opposite of what Putin and his senior leadership would want. They do not want an excuse for these nations to send in more foreign military aid to Ukraine. As I've said here, Putin does not want to create a situation to increase foreign aid to Ukraine. I believe this is one of the reasons why we have seen no recent targeting, at least reported, on Zelensky's life. We saw a lot of reports earlier in the war that there was teams out to try and take out Zelensky. And I believe this is just an example of this, because it would be, then Zelensky would be martyred, and as well, the increase in foreign aid. Look at, for example, when the North Koreans were involved in Kursk. Now, whether you are on either side of the fence of this, we can look at what became of that. What became of that was then more long-range strikes. So we need to remember, though, that's only North Koreans if they're there operating in Russian territory in Kursk. It would be different if they crossed into occupied Ukrainian territory, and different as well if it was then Belarus. in my opinion, Putin and his senior command do not want to give any more excuses and create a situation for more aid to go in. I believe for Ukraine, it's actually this in reverse. Ukraine wants and they need foreign aid to increase. This is why I proceed with caution, looking at any events that could potentially be false flags to draw in other nations. I believe it's far more likely we'll see Ukraine try and draw in another nation or draw in more support rather than Putin risk Poland or NATO or any of these draw in more support or provide more support or soldiers to Ukraine. So let's move on to the maps, and of course what my title is, I presume, going to be about. That Russia has 10x'd its speed of increase of gains inside of Ukraine. Now, what am I talking about? Well, we're going to look at some of the data, and it was brought to my attention from this message that I was sent across from someone behind the scenes. When looking at the kilometre squares data from Ukraine, might I suggest that we not only consider the month-to-month change as we have been doing, but also the year-over-year change as the practice with numerous economic statistics. For instance, comparing a given month to the same month a year prior is helpful as it removes some of the seasonal variation and can provide context on the macro level as to what the big picture and the long-term trend is. In this instance, we see the noted decline month over month into winter. But year over year, we see a roughly 10 times increase. So the Russians were about 10 times more effective in January 25 as they were in January 24. Of course, this is an uncomfortable truth to dwell on, but consider the opposite scenario. If Ukraine had managed to mount summer offensives in 2024, and that was 10 times as successful as their 2023 campaign, the Western pundits would have been all over that like a dirty rag. Statistics are fickle. There is as much in the interpretation and resulting narrative as there is in the data itself. So what we have spoken about, and we'll start on this, in what we were comparing, and potentially incorrectly, was month-on-month gains. We said, well, look, January 25 was less than December, less than November and October as well. And we thought that we would likely see this heading into winter. But what he's getting at is, yes, well, we know this because of seasonal change. What you need to be comparing, Willie, is January to January, because you're going to have at least more similar, say, conditions on the battlefield. And we'll have a look at these numbers here, and let's zoom in a little bit on another screenshot I've got. So let's look at January 24 to January 25. So January 24, we saw a change of 40 kilometre squares to 325. This is an 8 times increase. War Mapper is 33.1 and War Mapper is 427 this month. Remember, this is occupied. This is not taking into account Kursk, although if it was, it would be larger again, but we don't have those numbers back to 2024. But what we see is an almost 13 times increase. Now, to be fair, we only have 1 month to go off, and up to today, we only see 17.8 kilometre squares made in February. We can look back at the Feb numbers here, but it will be interesting to see if this trend continues. And this is very important because, yes, comparing January to June is not fair to do. So we will have a look, and we'll continue doing this as we move forwards as well. But I think he made a very good point over how you interpret statistics is just as important as the data within itself. So let's have a look at the maps. Of course, we have Ukraine in the center of your screen, the capital of Kyiv. We have turned this on, so the red check that you're going to see on this map will, of course, be ground that Russia has made over the past 24 hours. Now, the island boys turned peninsula boys have then increased their control into the center of Andriivka, and we also see red through Dashny as well. But we did see geolocated footage of Russian forces laying mines right where my cursor is at the moment yesterday, as well as about a week ago at this red building here too. Now, what do I believe? Well, I believe over the past week, this has looked like this, and all of this has come under control. It's actually easier to think that it's that with these further advances in here, because if this is so tight and so small area, why is it then continually being allowed or able to advance? But let's look at some other maps and how this may look. So we'll come on this Dachne front. We can see red check. We know there's definitely been advancements here. DivGen map, they have shown that all of Dachne has come under occupation all the way from the Vovcha down through the Dachne area and straight down this road. Then, of course, closing up this envelopment that is occurring and this pocket that is occurred. And this pocket would look significantly worse if this was connected down to Shevchenko. Let's have a look at the whole Kudakov area from Mr. Suryak Maps. Now, he's showing fairly similar, I'll say fairly similar, around Dachne to DivGen, but isn't showing that all of it has come under control, but the majority of it has, but further movements out to the south, but not this connection down the road to then these other elements too. Russian army took control of the eastern defences of Andriivka. We'll talk about this, and 70% of Dachne under control. Then we see Andriivka. What we definitely know that there's been increased control in Andriivka, but one thing which should be concerning on this map is that, of course, a pro-Ukrainian map isn't going to show Russian gains, or isn't going to want to show Russian gains, and a Russian map isn't going to want to show Ukrainian gains. So DivDen and a deep state, of course, it's probably going to have some level of bias here. But the Ukrainian deep state map is showing more control than Suryak. So what we're looking at is, see where this road comes down into the centre of Andriivka. See where this red dot is? Just by luck, the red dot on Suryak's map, which is basically showing where Andriivka is basically the most extreme westerly push, very close to, of where Deep State's own map is saying that the Russian forces are up to. So that is a major advancement in here if we combine these two maps. So Andriivka coming under control, further closing up this pocket. And again, all of these pockets is very, very dangerous for Ukrainian armed forces that have a large amount of soldiers that are deep in these pockets. And we've seen this again and again, especially when you have acute manpower shortages on the front line. Now, let's move our way up into the northeast. And what we spoke about yesterday was this crossing, the successful crossing of the Oskil into the southwest of Topoli by the Russian forces. And we spoke about what this shows us around reserves, but the ability to cross here too. Firstly, let's confirm this by then Suryak Maps. Yes, he definitely shows a crossing here. While the Russian army worked to expand the now undisputed bridgehead around Dovrichnia, which is just down here. So further, Dovrichnia that has occurred, of course, across the Oskil as well. It also launched a series of operations further north during the third week of January. In the first 2 weeks, the Russian forces made some tactical advances, notably the creation of a new bridgehead southwest of Topoli, as well as increasing pressure from the border. So he is showing that also on the border up here, they're increasing pressure down south also. So again, lengthening the front line works in Russia's favour, as Ukraine has numerically inferior numbers, that it is then further thinning out the forces. So we will see potentially more of that. Let's look then at what Deep State says about this crossing in Topoli. Enemy advance in the area settlement of Topoli. The enemy was essentially able to create another small bridgehead on the right bank of the Oskil River. The enemy made repeated attempts to cross the water obstacle in this area, and they began around mid-January, and the area was generally explored at the beginning of last month. According to preliminary information, the enemy managed to achieve success in the village, but the Defence Force units pushed back the enemy. After some time, the Russians made another attempt, but in a different place, and they managed to take positions on a chalk mountain south of the village, so high ground, forcing the river. So the map in this area has changed. The Russians also tried to create a bridgehead between Kamyanka and Topoli, but without success. They were unable to gain a foothold there and build on their successes. So this remains only a warning sign of future attempts by the enemy. Stabilisation measures are currently underway, and we very much hope this area will not develop into another large-scale bridgehead, as happened further south in the area of Dovrichnia, as we have spoken about, that there was this small crossing in the beginning, and then it has expanded to what it has become now. But this does tell us about the shortage of reserve forces to not be able to plug these holes, because the Russians are crossing the Oskil here. They're crossing a very difficult obstacle, which is water. It is an incredibly difficult obstacle, and have been able to do that into different areas. Could we see further expansion into Kharkiv? And if Kursk is as important as Zelensky says it is, well, the Russians hold more kilometre squares in Kharkiv than in Kursk. If negotiations are there, we could just see that. So let's talk about Kursk, as this is going to set us up for what we speak about in the negotiations. And I want to show you a couple of bits and pieces. One thing that has been concerning to myself is how many Iskanders and Tornadoes and other systems, even FABs, are being used around this area, not in Kursk itself, but further back, targeting Ukrainian build-ups and supply into this region. And what we know from Ukrainian media is supply, logistics, medical evacuation, all of this is very, very difficult in Kursk. As you push in like this, you are in turn surrounded on 3 sides. And we see this video come out today. Now, any of this, you can watch it on my Telegram if you'd like, but we can see a build-up of looking like military equipment here. You can see these creating like outwards facing like an iron ring for security in these systems as well. And this road heading down here, this is reported from then Russian pages of Iskander ballistic missiles striking these areas. So we can see that burning up. To get an idea of exactly the damage here is very difficult, but you can see hot areas in multiple fronts. And I wanted just to bring this up, as this is what I've been seeing a lot of recently, and I've put some geolocations on this. So the one today was right here. Of course, Sumy, and you've got where the Ukrainians have crossed into Kursk. And you can see where this was struck, in this forested area, so a bit of cover, a bit of camouflage, right on this main road. We saw on the 3rd of this month, a couple of days ago, a Tornado S cluster right in here, very similar location. We've seen a hell of a lot of drones operating on these roads to try and prevent then resources and logistics getting into Kursk. As well, we saw on the 3rd of Feb another Iskander just to the south of Sumy, down in approximately this location. And this is one of the things in Kursk, is the supply of logistics, both in and medical evacuation out or damaged vehicles out, is very difficult. We can see those drones, those AFPV fiber optics flying around these areas, striking everything from armoured vehicles through to light skin vehicles too. And then AMK, he shared actually a very similar map to myself, but shows a little bit more data. For Feb 4 to the 5th, he looks at then missiles in the red, the FABs in the orange, and multiple launch rocket systems in the sort of lighter orange, the yellowy orange here. And you can see that a large cluster of this, including the red, but it's sort of behind here, has been up around Kursk. As far as where has been the most of this is right around that area. And of course, this is covering a much smaller area of supply than in other fronts. If you want to then cover, the front of where Ukraine is supplying into Udashny front, you've got a lot of area. But up in here, you've got a very small area where it has to come through at some point. And the same is true in reverse. If you want to strike the Russian logistics heading out into Udashny, you have an area like this, and it gets smaller, of course, as it moves in and in. So it's just worth noting the increase, at least what I've seen as the increase of drone usage and missile and glide usage and multiple launch systems around this crossing too. But we'll keep that because that'll become more relevant in just a little bit. So let's look over negotiations. And we know that likely negotiations are going to take place. Will these fall through? I believe that is highly likely as well. So General Keith Kellogg, of course, who is President Donald Trump's special envoy to Russia and Ukraine, is going to the Munich Security Conference on the 14th to the 15th of February and speaking about Trump's goal to end the bloody and costly war in Ukraine. As we saw, Trump laid out the bare bones of a plan for Gaza yesterday. So hopefully at the Munich Security Conference, we'll get an idea of how his plan or strategy is actually going to look. But at this point in time, it is absolutely anyone's guess. And we have seen from statements from both Ukraine and Russia uncertainty around the possibility of actually doing this. But let's talk about a few things. So Zelensky has come out as well and says Kursk operation could be an important part of the negotiating process. Tomorrow will be exactly 6 months since the operation on the Kursk salient, a very important operation. You will see when we reach a diplomatic settlement at the end of the war what conditions the Russians will have for Ukraine regarding the Kursk salient. So saying that this is incredibly important, and you will see its importance when the Russians then say, well, we want X for that area. He says this is a very important step. I do not like to throw around words like historical. The whole life of Ukraine and the struggle is certainly a historical path, and therefore I will not throw around this word regarding this operation, but it was definitely very important. And he says that he's grateful to the soldiers defending and in Kursk too. But one thing I will say on this is I think the importance of Kursk, as we've gone over for now 6 months, is important informationally, not that important when we talk tactical. But Ukraine's industrial complex, it is information to get military aid in. And as we showed you before, of course, things like Kursk, long-range weapon strikes, North Koreans, all of that as well. So that part of it was important, but pure tactically, well, it's tied up a shitload of resources up in there. Let's look over more of what he has said. He emphasised the armed force of Ukraine are maintaining a stable situation there and will continue to do so. He says the Russians have very large losses there and are greatly underestimating them. Everyone, I think, is underestimating losses, Mr. President, because Zelensky stated on Piers Morgan's interview 2 days ago that Ukraine has lost 4,100 soldiers. And he says the Koreans and North Koreans are running away, and we see it. There's been a bit of different reporting recently around the North Koreans haven't been seen since mid-January, to other reporting going, no, they're still there dying by the thousands. Very, very difficult to know. But what am I getting at here? I'll show you evidence. This actually then occurred. This is the transcript of the video, and you can listen to it. This has, of course, interpreted slightly incorrectly, but if you listen to it, we have 45,100 losses, 390,000 cases of people being wounded. But he says that this is high because some then get wounded and come back to the front line as well. They're counted multiple times. That is also happening on the other side of the fence. He also says that the types of numbers, the first one is thousands of people that are missing, and that these are really in the thousands. Now, these numbers, we just see the disparity in these numbers, and then we overlay the disparity in firepower, artillery, middle-range weapons such as FABs at the front line too, and we can already see the problems popping up in these numbers. But what we know is these numbers are probably a lot higher, given the acute manpower shortage, needing to physically grab guys off the street to send them to the front line, and that these may be either a lot higher or the Russians' numbers are a lot lower. I don't believe it's going to be 10 or 20x as some are claiming. Whether we'll actually ever get real numbers on this, I don't really think so. But again, we will see. He noted several important objects in Kursk were hit with long-range weapons. We have struck several very important military points of the government, and I think they're not able to push us out of this territory in the near future. It's like a magnet. Keeps 60,000 of their soldiers in this direction today. The most important thing about Kursk wasn't striking the military points. It's the ability to strike those points. It was the ability to get policy shifted to then fire those weapon systems to be able to use them. But he says it's like a magnet. It keeps 60,000 Russian soldiers. That may be true, but yeah, it ties up Russian troops. But it's not Russia's line, which is crumbling in other areas due to acute manpower shortages. Ukraine does continue putting reserves into here as well, and it is tying up a lot of soldiers, tying up a lot of Russians and a lot of Ukrainian soldiers. But at this point in time, I would ask, well, who is more short on those soldiers? As Ukrainian Forum reported, the Kursk operation began on August the 6th. At that time, about 11,000 Russian military personnel, mostly conscripts, were in the Kursk region. The peak value of control here was around 1,300 square kilometres. Deep state, as of today, is at 428, a reduction of 67.08%. About 2/3 has been returned. So the situation there, as far as kilometre squares, isn't stable. As far as the losses in here, well, it's always questionable. There's no rock solid evidence to back up any of these numbers. Again, they say about 60,000 troops are concentrated in Kursk, and the losses in less than 6 months amounted to 38,000 people killed, wounded, and captured. So they're saying that nearly 40,000 Russians were killed, wounded, or captured in Kursk. But on the other side of this, we need to look at the ISR, those long, medium-range strikes here as well. Who's on offensive? Who's on defensive actions? The Kursk operation, in my mind, has never... It makes perfect sense from an informational point of view, and that's maybe what needed to happen. And we saw, of course, long-range strikes and other policies shift. But the future of this, and tying up personnel up here, it can potentially backfire and may be further backfiring. Now, before we go over all these negotiations further through a Bloomberg article, I want to just quickly look at this restructure. So this has come out today, that orders have been given for the restructuring. The headquarters of 6 corps will assume direct control of the sectors of the front, and each of them will have 5 combat brigades with a total strength of 12 to 15,000 men and about 700 to 900 units of heavy weapons such as tanks, APCs and artillery. Each corps will be assigned a specific area of responsibility and will include artillery, AD, recon, EW and support units. Now, this is not a new system. This is the division system that we showed you. And in the division system, you have brigades that can operate basically as its own small army. It is more flexible, can operate independently, and I think very importantly for the Ukrainian armed forces, actually can require less command, because we know there is a command problem. So this is what I showed you the other day, and this is, I think, just the bare bones idea to give you an idea of how this may look. So this is the Australian Army Corps. Of course, we have one div being the full-time army. So, excluding some other supporting elements, but the bare bones of it. So we have 3 brigades. We have 1 brigade, 3 brigade, 7th brigade. Each one, of course, you have your infantry in 1 brigade where I was served, and the Chads here was at one point 5 and 7th Battalion, but now it's 5 7th Battalion. We have artillery, we have engineers, we have signals, and then we have all the supporting elements. Other brigades, such as 3 Brigade or 7th Brigade, will have different areas of support due to how they will have a different, say, mission statements. So there may be mechanised infantry, motorised infantry, or air mobile infantry, say, in helicopters. Then you'll have those attached to it. Now, of course, you will have other elements that are to be attached as well, even the weirdos up on the hill. Sorry for the dig boys. But this is how it will look. And what can happen is these brigades, as they're its own small army, so to speak, can operate independently, and in Ukraine's case, will be given an area of responsibility on the front. So hopefully this reduces the amount of command, hopefully then promoting better commanders and increasing the competence. And one of the biggest problems we see is that link between like the artillery and the armoured and the infantry is not there, that is all going to be operating in a brigade. In the instance of 1st Brigade, we would see the infantry operating with its own artillery, its own then sappers, all of that. So that is where it's looking like it is shifting. But it is going to be a very, very difficult thing to do at wartime. It's very difficult to do anyway. My battalion, of course, just split back into 5-7, and there's a lot of moving parts in that. It's going to be very difficult. And I think this probably goes into more of this than is being reported. So General Sursky has come out that 50,000 soldiers from all branches of the armed forces are being transferred into the land forces. So they're being moved out of areas such as, we believe, about 5,000 out of the Air Force to be moved then under the land forces, or the army, so to speak. And they say that this is for rotation process. I believe a lot of this, or most of this, isn't for rotation. It's backfilling those elements that are in dire need of extra manpower, but also setting up maybe the basis to create these brigades. But it's going to be difficult, because if you pull off this area, this element that's going to have an area's responsibility somewhere else, I don't see how that is going to work. We've heard this floated before, but again, we will see, and we will keep up with it. So let's talk about negotiations, Kursk, minerals, losses, all of the remainder of what we needed to. So this was from Bloomberg. US set to unveil Trump's planned end 3-year war in Ukraine. So we can go over all of this, but I've put some key elements here to do. But basically, freezing the conflict, the Russian-occupied territories will remain in limbo. Ukraine will get some sort of security guarantees. Ukraine will have to then hold elections, and US will have potential access to Ukraine's critical minerals in exchange for US support and paying back potentially some of that support too. Of course, each one of these we could zoom in on massively and talk about this. Ukraine, security guarantees, Moscow can't attack again. We've also seen Russia indicate that it wants then guarantees too that Ukraine or NATO won't be able to attack further either. So if Ukraine's in NATO, well, we need some guarantee of that it won't attack, and that guarantee for Russia at the moment means Ukraine never in NATO, or if they remain outside security guarantees, they won't have the long enough systems or enough men to ever go back into those occupied areas as well. Kellogg had signalled that the US would like to see elections held in Ukraine after a ceasefire, and Trump indicated access to those critical minerals. The US president has also threatened Moscow with massive sanctions if he doesn't engage in talks. So we have heard this, that if Ukraine won't engage, US will cut aid. If Russians don't, they will increase aid to Ukraine, which will be very unpopular for Trump supporters, but they'll also sanction Russia harder. Furthermore, contact with Washington. Ukraine's top priority is an ultimate security guarantee, NATO. Kiev has acknowledged this is unlikely in the short term, and Zelensky said this week that he's open to elections after the war has ended. He's also spoken on, of course, that interview with Piers Morgan, that he's reiterated his readiness to talk to Putin to end the war. Although talks with Putin are currently illegal under Ukrainian law. And Russia, due to elections, doesn't see that Zelensky is legitimate. So this is why I think we're starting at a really sticking point, and I think it's highly likely that these talks will fall apart, as the positions where Ukraine is and Russia are in are vastly different and just so far apart at this point in time. What Russia is basically saying is, well, it's illegal to negotiate with us at the moment under your own law, so if then you were to negotiate with us, then, your leadership were to change, you may look back in hindsight and be able to have legal basis and say, well, actually, it was illegal at the time to do, therefore that is illegitimate. Of course, Putin also says that Zelensky is a illegitimate leader. To think about that idea of if it's then you've done the wrong thing by law and therefore it's being turned back, is if, like say a policeman, at least in Australia, if a policeman writes your name wrong on a speeding ticket, that could be seen as incorrect. That's on a tiny level, sort of what Putin is getting at. But in my opinion, as long as NATO is on the table, Russia will refuse to negotiate. But if NATO is not on the table, Ukraine, they may refuse to negotiate. We don't know exactly where Zelensky's position is on this. We know what he wants, but we also don't know exactly how things are looking inside the armed forces, because we have seen even American leaders say publicly and privately there are some very different conversations happening. We talk about those minerals and those rare earths. The problem with those is a lot of those are in occupied territory. And I also believe that territory is not going to be recognised as autonomous states or inside Russia. Russia may not negotiate here too. It's going to be very difficult to bring either side to the table. That's why I think ultimately it's highly likely that these will fall through, because the positions of where both leaders want to then start the negotiating process would be incredibly unpopular and risking huge internal unrest also. Something like Zelensky and Putin would have to be looking at, that if it is what the other side wants, the issue of unrest is massive, an issue of further security as well. So I don't know where this will go. I think it's more likely the war will continue grinding on. The tide of the war at the moment is in Russia's favour, as we showed you on the map. So again, we will see who's willing to make concessions here at the moment. Anyway, legends, have a great day, and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.